Good afternoon. My name is Kim Schoenholtz, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's panel on the outlook for U.S.-China relations. The host of today's program is the Stern Center for Global Economy and Business, which serves NYU through outreach to the broader community, including the academic, business, and policy worlds. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to begin with brief introductory remarks by each of the panelists, followed by audience Q&A. The session will finish at 6:15. For the Q&A portion, please enter your questions through the Q&A mechanism in Zoom. Since we have already received many questions from students and faculty, I will limit repetition by grouping the questions together. Please note that anonymous questions are not accepted. Let me now briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. Elizabeth Economy is a senior fellow for China Studies at the Council for Foreign Relations and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Economy is an acclaimed author and expert on Chinese policy. Her most recent book, The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, appeared in paperback last year. Politico has named her as one of the 10 names that matter on China policy. Dr. Economy received her PhD from the University of Michigan and has taught at Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Washington. Stephen Orlins has served as president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations since 2005. Previously, he was managing director of Carlyle Asia and chairman of the board of Taiwan Broadband Communications, one of Taiwan's largest cable, TV, and internet providers. Earlier in his career, he served as president of Lehman Brothers Asia. In the 1970s, he was a member of the State Department legal team that helped establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. He received his undergraduate and law degrees from Harvard. Brad Setzer is the Stephen A. Tannenbaum Senior Fellow for International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. His expertise includes macroeconomics and global capital flows. Dr. Setzer was Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Economic Analysis in the U.S. Treasury from 2011 to 2015. Previously, he was Director for International Economics for both the National Economic Council and the National Security Council. In addition to authoring numerous books and papers, Dr. Setzer blogs regularly at Follow the Money. He received his PhD in International Relations at Oxford. Elizabeth will now present her initial remarks, followed by Steve and Brad. Thereafter, we'll begin the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Steve and Brad, to discuss prospects for the U.S.-China relationship. I think we all recognize that the bilateral relationship is at one of its lowest points since formal relations were established more than 4 decades ago. What I'd like to do is just make 5 quick points about why I think we are where we are, and then what we might do, at least to arrest the downward trajectory, if not actually to reverse course. First, just a quick reminder that it takes 2 to tango. Responsibility for the current freefall in the U.S.-China relationship rests with both the Xi and Trump administrations. Both countries have undergone radical shifts in their foreign policies that have brought them into significant conflict. Xi Jinping's quest for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation has translated into a China that is more repressive and authoritarian at home and more ambitious and expansive abroad in ways that materially challenge U.S. values and interests. The U.S., for its part, has reset its relationship with China, moving away from a traditional approach of engage but hedge to one that I would characterize as compete, counter, and contain. In addition, the Trump administration's America First platform has telescoped U.S. values and interests on the global stage to the point that the United States can no longer be counted on to lead globally in addressing many of the world's most pressing challenges. Halting the downward spiral in the U.S.-China relationship will require both countries to modify their ambitions on the global stage and their approaches to the other. Second, the most immediate threat, both in terms of the bilateral relationship and the impact of the relationship on the global stage, is the trend toward economic and technological decoupling. I would argue that this decoupling process actually began with China, with its Made in China 2025 program. That's a project in which China is looking to ensure that it controls manufacturing in 10 critical cutting-edge areas of technology, such as new energy vehicles, new materials, and artificial intelligence, among others. It creates an uneven playing field for multinationals and limits prospects for U.S. companies to do business in China in many areas where they now lead globally. The Chinese government has also undermined the autonomy of its own private technology companies by enhancing the role of the Chinese Communist Party in the firms and passing a law in 2017 that required the companies to turn over any information that the Chinese government demands. These steps have led the United States and others in the international community to conclude that companies such as Huawei or Tencent, TikTok, cannot be trusted to protect users' information and may seek to shape users' experiences in ways that are antithetical to U.S. values. For example, by blocking all mentions of Tiananmen or Hong Kong democracy activists. For its part, the Trump administration has pushed U.S. companies to move manufacturing back to the United States from China, made it difficult for companies such as Huawei to access core components such as semiconductors that are essential to its very functioning, and has lobbied other countries hard to prevent them from either providing these same technologies or permitting Huawei access to the markets. The world is rapidly devolving into two camps, one that will use and accept Chinese technological infrastructure, standards, and platforms, and one that will not. This trend, I believe, will only be exacerbated as new technology standards are debated in various international standard-setting bodies. Third, I think the greatest danger to the bilateral relationship, or in the bilateral relationship, is military conflict in the South China Sea or over Taiwan. Under Xi Jinping, China has moved from staking claims around sovereignty to realizing them. He has created and militarized 7 artificial features in the South China Sea, and we've seen a marked increase in the assertiveness of the Chinese military with regard to a number of disputes, including with Taiwan, Japan, and India. The U.S. has responded by increasing its military presence in the Asia-Pacific, ratcheting up freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, strengthening military relations with allies and new partners. At the same time, however, as tensions and opportunities for miscalculation and accidents between the United States and China have increased, unfortunately, exchanges between the U.S. and Chinese militaries have fallen off significantly. Fourth, the most significant battle is the one over political values. There has been a sweeping crackdown over basic political and civil rights in China since Xi Jinping came to power. Most egregiously, of course, are the extraordinary human rights abuses in Xinjiang, where as many as 1 million Uyghur and Kazakh Muslims have been forcibly relocated into labor and re-education camps. There is continued repression in Tibet, new acculturation practices in Inner Mongolia, which have led to widespread protests there, and of course the new national security law in Hong Kong, which undermines the essence of the basic law and the one country, two systems agreement. The environment for foreigners within China has also become less secure. In 2017, China implemented a new law on managing foreign NGOs that put control of foreign NGOs in the hands of China's Ministry of Public Security and made their registration and activity approval process far more difficult. As a result, the number of foreign NGOs operating in China has dropped from over 7,000 before 2017 to under 500, sharply limiting opportunities for U.S.-China cooperation of the type that Steve's organization leads. In addition, we have seen an increasing number of cases of foreigners being detained without due process, such as the Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, more recently the Australian broadcaster Cheng Lei, the 12 Hong Kong citizens that were attempting to flee to Taiwan, and a near call for the 2 Australian reporters just the other week. In addition, Beijing is trying to shape norms and values in the international system to align with Chinese preferences. For example, it holds cybersecurity seminars and training for Belt and Road countries to advise them on how to do real-time censorship of the internet. It advances resolutions in the United Nations that undermine the ability of human rights activists to testify at various forums. And it tries to control the global narrative on issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan through coercive economic practices. I'm sure many of you remember just recently, a year ago, it punished the Houston Rockets and the NBA more broadly by canceling broadcasts and licensing agreements because of a tweet by the general manager of the Houston Rockets that said, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." I frankly find it extraordinary to think that China is punishing the NBA for something that a U.S. citizen said in the United States on a platform that is banned in China. And there's rising concern within the United States and other democracies about Chinese government influence operations. The United States, for its part, has stepped up to the plate on issues like Xinjiang and Hong Kong to criticize and sanction Chinese officials and companies involved in repression. It has called out China for its coercive tactics and has responded to the specter of Chinese influence with aggressive rhetoric, calls for the closure of Confucius institutes, the cancellation of visas for selected Chinese students, and the investigation of more than 1,000 researchers in U.S. universities and labs on suspicion of lying over their ties to the Chinese government or stealing intellectual property. While I believe that some amount of reset along these lines was necessary, I would argue that the form that has taken over the past few years has contributed to a rise in anti-Chinese sentiment and rhetoric in ways that are truly appalling. Finally, let me just conclude by saying that the issues that I've touched on only begin to suggest the profound divide that now characterizes the U.S.-China relationship. I don't actually think it's possible to bridge the divide at this particular point in time. I think it would require far more moderate voices to lead in both China and the United States. But that doesn't mean that we can't start the process. First, I think both countries should behave in ways commensurate with their great power status and find common purpose in cooperating to address issues like global public health, climate change, and standards around international economic development. This would be an important first and not overwhelmingly difficult step that both countries could take to help forestall a further deterioration in the relationship. Second, the US and China need to restart their comprehensive bilateral dialogue. These dialogues should not be the first thing to succumb when there's a downturn in the relationship. They should be the floor that prevents conflict from hardening into something more permanent, such as a Cold War. Third, in the area of decoupling, I think China should step back. It should allow its private companies to act according to their economic interests, and it should ensure a level playing field for multinationals in the areas identified in Made in China 2025. For its part, the U.S. needs to develop what former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates called a high fence in a small yard, to distinguish between those technologies that are truly of national security importance and those that are not. I also think that looking ahead, there may be some room for both sides to find new common ground around issues of data privacy. And finally, on human rights, the strongest card that the United States can play is to get back in the game in the United Nations Human Rights Council, to do the hard work of building coalitions to bring pressure to bear on China, not just among advanced democracies, but also among the developing economies in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. At the same time, within the United States, we should be using a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, to address potential malign activities by the Chinese government, recognizing that only a tiny percentage of Chinese students and researchers are likely engaged in any sort of influence activity. And of course, the United States should live up to its own best ideals around human rights. That would be our greatest strength of all. Now let me turn it over to Steve.
Thanks. In fact, please stay visible. And Brad and Kim, please stay visible. It's much more fun to talk to you on Zoom when you remain visible. I guess that's not happening. That's not happening. One of the difficult parts of talking on Zoom is you can't tell if anybody's laughing at your jokes. So let me just do four things. First, I think I need to fully disclose my various prejudices at this point. I need to talk a little bit about the history of U.S.-China relations because I've been around it for almost 50 years. Talk very briefly about where we are and where we're going and associate myself with Liz's recommendations. I think all of them are a great idea. First, my hat's off to Kim Schoenholtz. He has participated with me in 21 Track 2 dialogues that we have held, the National Committee has held with the Chinese, with Peking University and associated economists there. The Chinese would call him the Laodong Mofang, the labor hero, because he is the one who pulls together the different threads from both sides and allows the two sides to arrive at a consensus at the end of that. So if you expect me to criticize the moderator, you're not going to happen. Liz Economy is director of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, in addition to her many other accomplishments. So if you expect me to criticize her views, she can fire me. So that's going to be pretty limited. And then Brad, I follow his podcasts, his blog, Follow the Money. And he educates me. For instance, he was the person who made me aware very recently of China's vastly increasing current account surplus, which is something, again, we shouldn't look at bilateral deficits, but we should look at China's current account surplus. Fourth prejudice is it was the 50th anniversary 2 months ago of my starting the study of the Chinese language. And I started it because of our involvement, the United States involvement in Vietnam. I couldn't understand why good people, the American government who'd taken my parents in as refugees, did bad things, the war in Vietnam. So I believe that we didn't have enough Asia expertise, and studying Chinese was a way to get it. But it's left me throughout my entire life skeptical of the U.S. government. And fifth, as Kim mentioned in his introduction of me, I was lucky enough as a young graduate of Harvard Law School to be on the team that helped establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And there is a narrative that's prevailing today that the 41 years of diplomatic relations with the Chinese has been a disappointment. It hasn't worked, and I totally reject that. It may not be perfect, but again, somebody who arrived in Asia during the war in Vietnam, since we established diplomatic relations, no American soldiers have died in Asia. In the prior decades, 250,000 American soldiers died and millions of Chinese died. So to kind of reject a policy that has given us peace, I think is deeply mistaken and deeply misguided. In this 41 years, as Liz said, this is the worst that we've seen the relationship. I think there is no question, and it's the worst partly because of the breadth and the depth of the deterioration. I think back to the 3 times since I was in the State Department that U.S.-China relations really turned south. One was after June 4th, that after the killings that occurred on June 4th, the United States and China basically, we didn't break diplomatic relations, but both people-to-people relations and diplomats stopped talking to each other because President H.W. Bush believed we needed to maintain that relationship because the Soviet Union was still around. We still needed China as a partner in opposing the Soviet Union. He was able to maintain that. The second was when the United States mistakenly, in a NATO mission, mistakenly bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. It caused an enormous disruption in U.S.-China relations. Chinese surrounded our embassy in Beijing, but ultimately we were able to get through it. And last was in 2001 when we had a reconnaissance plane, an EP-3, flying near Hainan Island, and a Chinese fighter crashed into it. The plane ultimately ditched in Hainan, but was able to land. The Chinese pilot was killed, and it created an enormous risk in the relationship, and where communications were not good between the United States and China. We could not, our ambassador and our Secretary of Defense had great trouble reaching the leadership in China. Ultimately we negotiated a settlement, and relations continued on. Those 3 instances, which were the worst in my 41 years, are not comparable to now because not only, and as Liz has pointed out, both governments, the Chinese government and the United States government, are adopting policies which are creating problems in the relationship. On the Chinese side, I mean, Liz listed a bunch of Chinese policy in the South China Sea, Chinese, as I hope Brad will talk about, Chinese kind of not following through with promised economic reform from the 3rd plenum of the 18th Party Congress, not opening to foreigners the way they thought. Though today, the Premier of China, Li Keqiang, had a speech which he said, we're going to focus on more opening, continuing intellectual property theft, what Liz talked about in Xinjiang, the Hong Kong national security law, Taiwan, cyber violations, the initial response to COVID-19 and not sharing sufficient information with the United States, the NGO management law, which has reduced the people-to-people relationship with the rest of the world, including the United States, that those issues have pushed America away and in a way taken constituencies which used to favor constructive U.S.-China relations and turned them against it. On the United States side, my list is equally as long. The Trump administration's demonization of China. Its focus, as again I hope Brad talks about, its focus on a bilateral trade deficit rather than systemic reform in China. Its overly broad crackdown on Chinese students. Its closing of the Chinese consulate in Houston. I think of, when it's never been clear. They have not specified what went on, but when they say there was spying in the coming from the consulate in Houston, I'm reminded, some of you are old enough to remember Casablanca. But when the inspector says in the gambling, I'm shocked to find gambling here, and then is handed his gambling winnings, for those too young to remember that. Well, that there's spying going on in consulates is not something that should be a surprise. The arbitrary and capricious enforcement of our entity list, export restrictions that are bad for America, the expulsion of China from RIMPAC when they really were getting little benefit from it. I could go on, but it's much of it is a product of both the Chinese government's policies and the April 17th memo from the Republican National Committee to Republican candidates throughout the United States, saying when the Trump administration is criticized for not handling the coronavirus well, just say he banned visitors from China, and anyhow it's all Chinese, it's all the Chinese fault. So some of these disruptions in the relationship are created by the politics. And the last factor is there are those in the administration, probably Mr. Navarro, Secretary Pompeo, a number of others, who believe that China is an existential threat to the United States. I believe that is not the case, and I think Brad and Liz, if we want to discuss that later, we can. What has happened? Part of the path for the pandemic was laid not only by China's not sharing information early on, but by the US reducing CDC presence in China to the point that we lost our early warning system. That if you look at the data, in 2016, the CDC had 41, both American employees and Chinese employees in China, including one who was embedded with China's CDC. And then at the time of the pandemic, that was down to 11. So what's happened is this deterioration in the relationship has kind of paved the way for the pandemic to ravage America. I'm running out of time, so let me just say, I think we've got 3 time periods in the US-China relationship going forward. One is the next, till the election day, that between now and then, there's a confluence in the administration between those who believe that China is an existential threat and those who believe that they must use China to see if they can secure Trump's reelection. So it is very difficult to predict what is going to happen. Then there's the period from the election to inauguration, where I think the campaign folks step back, but those, especially if President Trump loses, those who believe China is an existential threat may seek to take actions which make it difficult for a new administration to reverse that. And finally, the period after either President Trump is inaugurated for a second term or Vice President Biden is inaugurated for a first term, when one hopes we will move back to a more stable, professional U.S.-China relationship. And on that note, I've gone exactly 10 minutes, Kim, per your request. Let me turn it over to Brad, and it's good to see him because usually I'm reading his blog.
Well, I'm more comfortable writing than I am speaking, so I'm quite happy generally to interact through the pen or the electronic equivalent. Rather than look forward and look at Steve's 3 coming periods, I thought I would look back much more on the economic side. and look at what I would characterize as kind of three shocks to the economic relationship. The first shock, I'll call the China shock to US workers, starting with WTO entry. The second shock is, probably the most debatable, but I think there probably at some point was a Chinese shock to US business, when US business lost confidence in the direction of economic and political change inside China. And then third, there's clearly been a Trump shock, which really is tied much more to the election of President Trump and the policies President Trump has chosen to pursue than anything that China itself has done. So the first shock, which I think is important for setting the stage that eventually leads to the Trump shock, was the Chinese shock to US labor markets, to US workers after China's WTO entry. And you could imagine a trade agreement, and China's entry into the WTO was a major agreement leading to a symmetric expansion in trade. The US would import more from China, but it would also export more to China. But that, broadly speaking, didn't happen. US exports grew, but US exports and manufacturers grew relatively more slowly. And they certainly didn't grow as fast as US imports from China increased. In the period immediately following China's WTO entry, the US deficit from China, from Asia, and from the world in manufactured products increased by about a percentage point of US GDP. Significant, but to be honest, let's admit, compared to the kind of shocks that we're seeing from COVID-19, not huge, but there. Probably 1 million workers in manufacturing communities, not just the workers themselves, saw a significant loss of jobs, hours, and opportunity. And the broader impact on those communities meant, according to the famous work of the Otto, Dorn, and Hansen in the China shock, another indirect 1 million jobs lost. Now, there were gains elsewhere in the US economy. The losses were concentrated in those parts of the country that had strong manufacturing sectors, whether in electronics, furniture, home appliances, or the like. And the gains were generally found elsewhere. So it was a regionalized shock. But it corresponded to a period of time when China was very friendly to multinationals and very friendly to companies that wanted to use China as an export base, most obviously by intervening very heavily in the currency market to hold China's currency, the yuan, down, kept it from appreciating, when the positive shock should have pushed the yuan up quite significantly. This is the period of time when China's overall surplus rises to around $400 billion with the world, and when Chinese intervention in the foreign exchange market on an annual basis tops $500 billion. Why is this an important period? Well, because in contrast to now, when political action on reactions to China have dominated US policy discourse, the US did not actually respond very aggressively to the China shock in a policy sense. Two things I would note here. One, the special safeguards that were negotiated as part of China's WTO entry, so-called 421 safeguards, were never in fact used, even though there clearly was a surge in US imports from China, precisely what those safeguards were designed to react to. And then second, even though China was clearly manipulating its currency, the US made a political judgment not to name China a currency manipulator on the grounds that it wouldn't accomplish much. But broadly speaking, the consensus in the US at the time was that the shock could be managed, that the US could specialize in other activities, and that the surge in trade with China didn't demand a major policy response. Second period, And I think that was also very tied to the fact that at the time, many multinational companies were really benefiting from the use of China as a production base. It helped them lower the price of their goods, take markets, and raise profits. Apple would make less money if it couldn't use China as its production base. Second period, you might call the China shock to US business. And I think it's hard to precisely date that shock, but the convenient date would be President Xi and his emergence as China's leader. I think there was a recognition then, and Liz has written about this more persuasively than anyone else, a recognition that President Xi actually really was a communist. Now, by a communist, that doesn't necessarily mean a socialist. China's commitment to social safety nets leaves a lot to be desired. But she clearly believed in the leading role of the Communist Party in Chinese life, and that included an economic life, private business included. And she clearly was committed to maintaining a large state role in the economy and to using the power of China's state to accelerate China's technological convergence. All that seemed rather threatening to US business, particularly because China's technological convergence was proceeding much faster than China's convergence in the economic sphere. State enterprises, state-backed national champions, even privately owned, in China were emerging as real competitive and technological threats. Tech transfer doesn't seem like such an onerous requirement if you believe that the companies with which you are informally expected to partner with and transfer technology to won't be capable of using it. And state-backed competition didn't seem such a threat when it seemed like the state and state-backed companies were lumbering giants, incapable of emerging and competing effectively in international markets. Huawei started off largely displacing US and European and Canadian telecommunication equipment suppliers in the Chinese market, and then became the supplier who took markets in Africa and other lower income countries, and then the dominant supplier in Europe. So it quickly had moved from being well behind the technological frontier to being on the frontier or close to it in some sectors, China and Chinese companies. And in those sectors where China lagged, it was clear through China 2025 that China intended to use the power of the Chinese state to accelerate convergence and potentially displace US companies. US companies exporting to China, like Boeing, and also US companies producing in China for the Chinese market. Third shock is the Trump shock. It's clearly related to both of the previous two shocks. The political preconditions, in my judgment, for a presidential candidate to win an election based on a platform that quite clearly argued that trade with China was the result of a bad trade deal that needed to be renegotiated, stemmed from the fact that there are workers in manufacturing-intensive communities who really believed that the China shock had diminished their opportunity, and that legacy remained. Trump, though, has trade grievances against pretty much everyone. Half the time he seems to sound like Europe is a bigger trading problem than China. So the fact that there was a set of business concerns around trade and the economic relationship with China meant that the trade war with China had broader political support than Trump's other attempted trade wars. So I think Trump introduced a set of new concepts or brought them to prominence. One was a notion that the original terms of China's engagement, economic engagement with the world, weren't fair, weren't reciprocal. He noted things like back at the time of China's WTO entry, China's tariffs were allowed to remain much higher than US tariffs. And that seemed unreciprocal, unfair, and all that. And he arguably has a point, but trade professionals would say that's the consequence of not having done any global trade deals since China's WTO entry. But it does, on the face, seem a bit strange that China has, under the WTO rules, the right to impose higher tariffs on US goods than the US does on China. Trump also famously focused on the bilateral trade deficit, the fact that the US was importing $500 billion from China and only selling $150 billion of goods. Now, bilateral measures are imperfect. The $500 billion includes an awful lot of Taiwanese, Japanese, and Korean content and the like. But it did reflect the fact that the US is a very large manufacturing importer and China is a very large manufacturing exporter. And the sectors that were winning on the US side were in different parts of the country, in different business lines, and the like. And then third, Trump made clear that the US was not going to be bound by its WTO tariff commitments and introduced tariffs as a tool of negotiation and leverage in a way that they hadn't been used before. Tariffs in the past had been essentially off the table, except in a few narrow cases, because the US was bound by its WTO commitments. Trump decided that the US was going to exit from those constraints, which meant that US-Chinese economic relations had to find a new equilibrium. I think the question that has yet to be settled, and may not be settled even by the election, is whether the trade war has, in a sense, been fought to exhaustion, and the phase one deal at the end reflects a settlement that will prove more enduring because it provides the basis for limited decoupling, or whether the phase one deal is the precursor to a new either renegotiation of the relationship or renegotiation of the deal. The essence of the phase one deal was to leave a whole bunch of issues undecided. The issues around China's technological convergence, China 2025, the issues that the US has with the Huawei, TikTok, examples of Chinese technological success. Those were sort of essentially set aside and not dealt with in the deal. What the deal did do was take the threat of future tariffs off the table for a while, which has been important. And it committed China to buy more US goods, even with significant tariffs on $250 billion of trade. The question is whether or not that provides a framework for a more decoupled world, and whether trade can in some sense become less central to the relationship, not because it's a force that is enormously positive, but because there's a settlement that has provided clarity around the scope of trade engagement, while other issues, particularly issues of technological competition, haven't been addressed. I think I'll stop there.
Great. That was wonderful. Thanks to all three of you. And Steve, thank you for the flattery. It's really hard to follow up this introduction because you've covered so many bases. But let me start by bringing up Steve's question, which is sort of a big issue. Namely, is China an existential threat to the United States? I assume you meant that both in terms of security, economic issues, and all kinds of other issues, ideology, potentially even cultural. So I think it would be great if each of you would have a moment to address that.
Yeah, what I meant, Kim, is it's not a military existential threat to the United States. It's neither in China's history or tradition or current plans to have a military confrontation where they land in San Francisco. I think that's it. And the economic, look, if we don't rebuild our infrastructure, if we don't make investments in America, if we don't Brad's point about how trade has had very unequal effects throughout the United States. If we don't spend a lot of money kind of retraining people who've been displaced by trade, if we don't rebuild America, then not only is China an existential threat, the EU is, everyone is, in the sense that we will stop being the great country that we are.
Great. Elizabeth or Brad, you want to jump in?
I would agree with both of the points that Steve just made. I don't anticipate that China has plans to land or bomb or anything with San Francisco or anywhere else in the continental United States. But I do think that China poses, existential is such a big word, but pretty close to an existential threat when it comes to many of the norms and values of the liberal international order. And if you just take, ideas around freedom of navigation or free trade or basic, what we would call universal, human rights, civil and political liberties, freedom of assembly and of speech and of media, religion, et cetera. These are all things that China Chinese interests and values don't align with those. And I think what we see now with this much more ambitious and expansive China under Xi Jinping is an effort, as he himself has said on several occasions now, to lead in the reform of the global governance system. And from my perspective, that is really upending the current system. And many people will say, oh, China isn't really trying to, China has benefited from the system. That's the line that you hear all the time. And it has benefited from the system. And now it believes, under Xi Jinping, that it has enough military and economic wherewithal, as well as political influence, to shape that system in ways that better serve its current interests. And some of its current interests are things like pushing the United States out of East Asia as the regional, dominant military power, rewriting rules of the game when it comes to human rights norms, setting up new standards and new values around things like internet governance. So for me, I think that China does pose a form of an existential threat. I think we have to recognize the really serious challenge that it poses to some of the values and norms that the United States and other market democracies have held most dear for, 70 years now.
I'll respond to Liz, but let Brad go first.
All right. Well, I think the answer is to the question of whether China poses an existential economic threat is clearly no. Ultimately, the strength of the U.S. economy is overwhelmingly a function of policy choices that the U.S. makes at home that impact most of our daily lives far more than whether we're importing from China or Vietnam, or frankly, whether GM has a huge operation in China or not. That doesn't fundamentally change the trajectory of the US economy. It matters much more for individual businesses, but for the overall economy, we can survive. We're not threatened by China's success. That said, the success of a country which is on trajectory to have the world's largest economy within the next 10 years, with a very different economic and political system than ours, poses enormous challenges. It poses the challenge Liz outlined in Asia, where China's ambitions would involve, if realized, domination of the United States' relative position. And it poses a challenge in the sense that China is big enough, and its market is big enough, and its reach is big enough, that the possibility that China would set up its own set of parallel institutions, which doesn't destroy the institutional order that the US created, but creates a parallel one that may be as important or more important, that threat is real. So I think China is not existential, but it is clearly one of the largest challenges that the US has faced in some time.
But I would ask Liz though, Kim, does the United States pose a greater threat to the international order than China does. We fail to appoint judges in the WTO. We withdraw from the Iran agreement, the International Court of Justice. We've never adhered to the law of the sea. We withdraw from the WHO. It's to compare China's trying to change the world order versus the United States. I would argue that in the last 3.5 years, the United States has been more destructive towards the world order than China. To the extent, you're absolutely right in one aspect, to the extent that human rights norms and others that apply within China, that the international order is trying to apply them within China, then China wants to change those rules. Absolutely right. But with respect to the others, you know, I think the United States is more a culprit than the Chinese.
So, I mean, I think we'd have to distinguish between this period of the Trump administration and, you know, everything that has come before and hopefully everything that comes after. But again, what I'm talking about, and U.S. pulling out of things is indeed quite destructive. I agree. But, you know, it's funny because China has stayed in the Paris Climate Accord, of course, but its CO2 emissions have increased each year for the past 3 years. U.S. emissions have, in fact, decreased. And that's not an argument that we should have pulled out. We shouldn't. We should get ourselves right back in the agreement, of course, as somebody who's spent much of my life focused on China's, you know, environmental issues and climate change. There's no doubt about it. And certainly we shouldn't be pulling out of the World Health Organization or any of the other agreements and institutions that the Trump administration has withdrawn us from or has threatened to withdraw us from. But again, what I'm talking about is it's a long-term, you know, effort to subvert, you know, norms and institutions. And, you know, China's setting standards in the ITU around technologies, right? Or China's surveillance, you know, system that it's exporting to many countries. I mean, willing partners. It's not imposing these things on countries, but it does, you know, act to strengthen authoritarian regimes around the world. You know, it could be China's establishing parallel, you know, organizations that are different. But I would argue also that within the United Nations, within existing institutions, China threatens things. It chips away at norms until it's kind of like the South China Sea, Steve, right? Where, you know, it dredges all of the sand. It builds up these islands. It militarizes them over a period of, you know, whatever, 17, 20 months. And all of a sudden you blink and the entire landscape has changed. And that's how I see China behaving in international organizations. It's not a big thing like the United States just withdrawing, but it's over time chipping away at norms and values.
Right. You've all painted how complex this relationship is. It extends into the economic sphere, the political sphere, the security sphere, cultural sphere. When U.S. policymakers are trying to set goals or devise a strategy for addressing, let's say, economic issues, to what extent can they separate those economic issues from issues like security issues, human rights issues, and all the rest? Does it make sense? Is there some sense of separation that makes sense? Or is everything have to be bound together when the two countries are addressing each other? I'm surprised to hear quiet.
Waiting for somebody else. I just
I was waiting
kind of on a rant back there. I'll say just briefly, so that I'll give these guys some time to think. I guess from my perspective, there are certain areas where, you know, these issues are distinct, and then others where they are conjoined together. And part of the challenge is deciding, you know, where those boundaries actually exist. And I think the Trump administration has been less bounded. The boundaries have shifted in ways that make it much more likely that they are going to use economic tools for political reasons, right? So the sanctions on, you know, around Xinjiang or around Hong Kong, I mean, those are coming from Congress as well. So it's not really just the Trump administration. I should make that clear. So I think there's less clear divide. I think it's very difficult. I think it's one of the great challenges. And part of the challenge comes because China itself so often uses economics for political purposes, right? And so the temptation to some extent, right, is at this point is to respond in kind. I guess I'll just finish by saying I think what this administration has done well is to take a step back and to look across the board at each one of those issues, politics, security, and economics, and say, where have we been disadvantaged? You know, Brad was talking about where has it been unfair? Where has there not been reciprocal sort of policy? And to say, okay, time to reset this table, right? And to restore some sense of fairness and balance. We can argue that in many places it's been excessive. Steve and I both talked about what's taken place inside the United States in terms of, you know, attacks on, you know, on Chinese students, et cetera, you know, just in terms of the rising, you know, anti-Chinese sentiment that's not good. But I do think that this administration has done an important job of resetting the relationship. And maybe now for the next administration, assuming that's a next different administration, there's an opportunity to recalibrate.
I take it you're saying that they've done so many things badly. It's easy for the next administration to reverse some of those things. But that's the way I would interpret it.
That's not what I'm saying.
I think Liz is right. It's more difficult today now to separate the issues. They all bleed one into the other. I'm repeatedly pointing out to the Chinese government that the South China Sea issue, where years ago I said, you know, even before the arbitration tribunal decision under the Convention of the Law of the Sea, even before they found that China's reclamations were inconsistent with the law of the sea, I was calling them out on them. I said, that issue, it sounds like it's just the South China Sea issue. It's not. It not only bleeds into an overall view of China, it bleeds into trade cases. It bleeds into investment cases. It bleeds into human rights, because you lose your credibility. And that it's extremely difficult now to shape policies which don't take into account the entire relationship.
Brad, did you want to jump in?
I guess I'll make three observations. First observation is that the traditional way security and economics were kept distinct was the argument that increasing economic interdependence would over time constrain China, change China, improve China. So you didn't want to use economic levers too heavily because the long-run success of U.S. strategy hinged on facilitating China's integration into the global economy. That was a useful, I mean, I don't know if it's useful, but that was a mechanism for arguing that separate spheres should be kept separate, and you shouldn't bring economic pressure, the strongest economic tools of pressure, to bear to try to influence other spheres of the relationship. The other argument is the argument that President Trump has made, which isn't really the argument that a lot of his administration makes. And that is, you know, to put it baldly, who cares about human rights or political change in China? What really matters is China buying our stuff. And if you take that view, then you also end up keeping economic leverage in the economic realm, because you're essentially using your economic tools to achieve or try to achieve economically nationalist, but economic goals, not to react to political or human rights or the South China Sea. I think it will be very hard, in part for the reasons Liz has outlined, that the fact that China uses and links access to its markets to silence around certain political issues and the like, I think that it will be very hard in that world for either of the two arguments for keeping economics separate to win out.
Kim, can I add a comment? China has changed, and China has changed for the better. And we need to look at it over this 50-year period, this 48-year period since President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger visit, or since I moved there in 1979. When I moved there, I couldn't travel outside of Beijing. I couldn't have lunch or dinner with the Chinese who graduated from college, where the word is fan pei. They were, what is the word in English? They were sent to the place where they had to work. They couldn't even choose it. They couldn't travel abroad. They couldn't talk about anything. The idea that China, that investment and trade hasn't changed China is wrong. It has helped change China. And there's studies about places where there have been foreign investment tend to be more, have better human rights standards, have better labor standards, have better environmental standards. So the idea that this has failed is another part of the fictional narrative. Is it perfect? Of course it's not perfect. There are tons of problems, and we need to continue to focus on the problems, but we need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that in fact trade and investment have succeeded.
Okay, let me just say, now that Steve raised that, I have to say one thing, which is, I would agree with you, Steve. So I'm not in the camp that says engagement has failed. But I do think it's important to look at the difference sort of pre and post Xi Jinping. And I think if you were making this argument back in 2010, 2011, it would be much easier for me in any case, to swallow the idea that, foreign trade and investment has had, some kind of very positive effect on helping to open China. You had a much more vibrant internet. It was a really virtual political space in many respects, right? Clamoring for improvement in the environment, even calls for political reform were tolerated. It was a really different China politically in that period before Xi Jinping. I think it's hard to make the case now, looking at what has happened, what has transpired politically in China. Look, just even the point that I made earlier about the foreign NGO law, right? That affects us and the kind of work that we do very directly. Very difficult to make the case that the foreign trade and investment is playing that same role. So I think you can argue that it can play that role. It may play that role, but I would argue that at this point in time, it really is not playing that role.
You know that China has progressed this way over time. It has never been a linear increase. And we're in a period, I don't deny the tightening, I don't deny the problems created by the NGO law. I've led American NGOs in trying to get it amended in China and trying to get it implemented properly. So I agree with that, but I think you have to look at it over a long period. And I've lived in China during periods of tightening. I lived in China on June 4th. I lived in China during the spiritual pollution campaign. And what happens is there's pushback against this over time. So we have to be careful when we craft policies that we understand that China will change, that it is neither a monolith nor is it static.
So let me pick up on something that Liz started with. And she sort of articulated, and you can come back to this, Liz, later, but you articulated some of the goals that you would set for American policymakers in the next few years in trying to, what their objectives should be in the relationship with China. And I wanted to pose the question to Brad and to Steve to say, if you were in charge of U.S.-China relations over the next few years, what goals would you prioritize and what strategies would you use? Brad, let me start with you if it's okay.
Sure. So I think I would start with a recognition that the U.S. lacks sufficient economic leverage to compel China to change the fundamentals of its economic system. So the basic choice the U.S. faces is what level of economic interaction do you want with a China that, broadly speaking, despite Steve's optimism, is probably going to look a lot like what it looks like now, particularly since it doesn't seem like President Xi is going anywhere anytime soon. And a China that will, in all probability, succeed in a narrow sense at increasing its economic autonomy by displacing certain U.S. products. I think you would have to assume that China's efforts in the chip industry will bear at least partial success, and that China will make a functioning, small, under 200-seat civil aviation jet, something I would note that the US and Boeing isn't able to do, but hopefully we'll be able to do soon. And so in that broad context, my assumption is that economic engagement and economic interaction is going to be more restrained than it was 5 or 6 years ago. That the basic shift that Trump started won't be fully reversed. We're not going back to the past. And the basic challenge will be to find rules for a more limited form of integration that allows decoupling in those sectors where decoupling is necessary. I would include pharmaceuticals in that. I mean, others will draw the line differently. I think we need to think carefully about electronic supply chain vulnerabilities and whether there are certain products that US companies cannot manufacture without China's help, and therefore China has already gained potential sources of leverage. But equally, we need to find those areas where trade and integration doesn't pose a threat. There's no obvious reason why a less integrated than in 2015 trading relationship couldn't involve the exchange of soybeans for Chinese-made apparel, clothing, and home appliances. The ground rules that would allow trade to no longer be at the forefront of all the dialogue, I think that would be kind of the long-run goal. And part of that is to open up space to allow, hopefully, cooperation on things like the environment and climate. But I would also, in all honesty, we spent the last 4 years talking exclusively about trade. Trade delivers at most a shock to US GDP of a percentage point, trade with China, maybe a little more if you don't do anything in response. And the COVID shock led to a 10% contraction in output in the second quarter. There are actually more important things than the trade of soybeans for home appliances.
We could spend the next 12 hours talking. Liz says every one of her points is I agree with. On the recommendation side, it's right. What we need to do is step back and recognize that the policies, the demonization of China that is occurring in the United States is destructive to our foreign policy goals and to the American people. That what's happening is when you confront the Chinese the way Secretary Pompeo did in the speech at the Nixon Library and say, we're counting on the Chinese people to throw off the yoke of the Chinese Communist Party. What that does is anytime an American raises an issue, whether it's economic reform, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, South China Sea, you name it, it's seen in the context of that. And they're therefore not responsive to the US government. You want to talk about the enforcement of the national security law in Hong Kong? That's because you're trying to undermine the rule of China, the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. You want to talk about Xinjiang? That's because you want terrorist incidents in Xinjiang. You want to talk about implementing the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress? That's because you want to undermine the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, that every single thing that you raise is seen in that context. So the first thing we need to do is talk about China in a rational way. Where we need to compete, we should compete, but where we need to cooperate, climate change, confronting economic crisis, terrorism, pandemic, we need to find ways to cooperate. And from what I want from our leaders is to focus on the cooperation Obviously, when we need to compete, we compete. It's fine. If we need to run freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, don't run them. You don't have to put them on CNN. You don't have to stick your thumb in the eyes of the Chinese. There's so many things that we can do. And that's why I wasn't kidding with Liz by saying what has happened is we've seen actions by our own government that hurt the American people. And especially they hurt kind of not, they don't hurt the wealthy people so much, but they really hurt the working class of the United States. Tariffs hurt the working class of the United States. When prices go up, it ain't the Chinese who are paying it, it's the Walmart customer who's paying it. This competition that the Trump administration has, the strategic competition that the administration has so focused on, will require us to take money, well, we're out of money now because of our pandemic relief, take money from social programs, take money from education, take money from infrastructure to put it in the defense budget to compete with China militarily. So we've defined ourselves into those problems. So we need to stand back and reverse a lot of the bad stuff that's gone on. You're muted, Kim.
Sorry. Liz, did you want to follow up, take us back to compete, counter, and contain? You're muted.
My three C's. Right. And of course, what's missing from that is what we've just been talking about, which is, finding areas of cooperation. And again, I think, competition is good, and we should be willing and able to do it openly. I think pushing back against China when necessary is also important. But we need to find some common ground the way that we used to. I think that's critical. And it's also critical for the United States and its standing on the global stage. A lot of people thought that when the U.S. withdrew from all of those institutions and agreements that Steve mentioned, that China was somehow going to rise and fill the vacuum. Now, remember, there are a lot of media reports to this effect. But China didn't rise, actually, to fill the vacuum. Xi Jinping talked a lot, but actual action to sort of forge new agreements or to address issues around the refugee crisis or even on climate or whatever it might be, China did not step up to fill the gap. Instead, you had on various issues kinds of constellations of smaller actors that tried. But really, no two countries have the same political and economic wherewithal that the United States and China do. And so it's incumbent on us, frankly, to step up and to not just focus on our narrow self-interest, like the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation in America first, and to consider the global good as part of our own concept of a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation in America first, that these issues are part of what we stand for and what we want to do for ourselves and for the rest of the world. So I guess that's, my way of ending on that. I do want to say one thing in response to some of the chat questions, if I could, just on this issue. Some people have raised, and there have been many good questions. I was tempted to type in some responses, but I wasn't sure that was really appropriate. So apologies for that. But just on this issue of whether, the U.S. is one-sided media and China has a one-sided media. And so we're basically both the same, this kind of equivalence. We're really not the same, and the simple fact of the matter is that we couldn't have this discussion in China. And we openly, right, with open participation from masses of people saying whatever they wanted to say without fear of some kind of retribution, might or might not happen. And we have Chinese news stations, CGTN, perfectly able to broadcast 24/7. China Daily, you can pick it up in, newsstand on the street corner in New York City in the little, freebie thing, whatever. You cannot access the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post freely in China. You can't access an English language newscast freely. You can get CNN in some places, and then you can have somebody say something that the Chinese government doesn't like, and it's blacked out. So, yes, we've got Fox News, we've got MSNBC, we have the full range of what one might call biased media or media with a certain perspective, but we've got it all. And that is a very fundamental difference between the United States and China.
So, Brad, I wanted to just encourage people to look at your blog, Follow the Money, which is really excellent. And to do that, I was hoping you might, this is probably the last question, hoping you might comment on where China's headed in trying to internationalize the RMB. What are the factors that are affecting that process?
Well, thanks for the plug for my blog, by the way. You actually write a pretty good blog yourself, but we'll set that aside for the moment. Like in general, I'll make a general observation to just kind of get it off my chest so that I can focus on your actual question, which is that I think that the internationalization of the renminbi tends to attract way more attention than it really is warranted. Particularly more attention from people in the US who think it is a threat than is warranted. If the internationalization of the renminbi means that a whole bunch of investors around the world pour a lot more money into the Chinese government bond market because China offers an interest rate on 10-year bonds of close to 3%, and you can't get anywhere close to 1% on 10-year US treasuries, and you can't even get 0 on German treasury bonds, then all that does is create pressure on China's currency to appreciate, which would make, through natural market forces, China less attractive as a location for global production, and Chinese consumers more able to buy the rest of the world's products. So the notion that foreign inflows into the Chinese government bond market are in some way a threat to the United States is one that I find difficult. There is a component of the internationalization of the yuan that is tied to China's desire for autonomy from the US payment system, and not domestic US payment system, but the global payment system that uses the dollar. So for a very long time, most trade between, say, China and Russia, which doesn't touch the United States in any physical way, was nonetheless denominated in dollars. And anything that is denominated in dollars tends to at some point touch a US legal entity and thus at some point be potentially sanctionable. So a big part of the effort to internationalize the yuan is very tied to a desire to make sure that China can trade with the world in a way that the US can't sanction. And the irony or strangeness is that China has progressed much, much, much more slowly on that agenda than anyone would have expected 6 or 7 years ago. In part because the internationalization of the yuan was always subordinate to Chinese domestic policy goals. So when China wanted to manage a set of economic shocks associated with the rise in the dollar in 2014 and 2015, the fall in oil prices, China's own economic contraction, and they believed a weakening of the yuan was called for. They didn't want foreign capital flows to make the weakening of the yuan more destabilizing than it need be. And so they limited access to the Chinese market to foreign capital, which had as a byproduct, it made the yuan less attractive as a global settlement currency. I think China now, given the broad shift in the relationship, is going to put a lot more priority on increasing the use of the yuan in China's own trade. And I don't think there's that much the US can do to stop it. The US can certainly accelerate it with sort of overuse of US sanctions. The acid test comes when it's time to start figuring out how you denominate, say, trade between Africa and Iran. Just to pick 2 random parts, will that be denominated in yuan? Will that be denominated in dollars? Well, probably not if it involves Iran. Or will it be denominated in euro, which is a perfectly reasonable alternative to the dollar? And the irony that I at least observed in a recent news story is that when China and Russia reached agreement to reduce the use of the dollar in their own trade, they didn't actually decide to use the yuan. They decided to use the euro.
Great. Well, first, I'm sure everybody in the audience is joining me right now to thank our panelists for their wonderful contributions. It's been a great discussion. Thank you very much. We also hope to see our audience again. There are 3 upcoming events from the center in the month of October. On October 6th, we have a panel on the LIBOR transition. And then on October 15th and 27th, we're going to have fireside chats with the president of the Minneapolis Fed and the director of research at the IMF, respectively. So thanks to our panelists and many thanks to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you.